I was lying on the cold kitchen floor, and my world was spinning in dark circles. My vision blurred as I stared at the legs of the kitchen table, which seemed to be moving further away. Every breath felt like I was trying to inhale thick, heavy sand. A sharp, squeezing pain gripped my chest, making it impossible to move. I looked up and saw my husband standing over me, but he didn't move a muscle to help. I whispered his name, begging for him to do something, but he just stood there with his hands in his pockets. He actually sighed, as if my struggling for air was an inconvenience to his evening. Behind him, my mother-in-law stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't look worried at all. In fact, she looked bored. "It's just another one of her episodes," she said, her voice dripping with calm poison. "She loves the attention, doesn't she?" I reached out a shaking hand toward my husband, gasping for him to dial 911. I told him I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. He didn't bend down. He didn't touch me. He just told me I was embarrassing him and that I needed to stop being dramatic. When the pain flared again, I tried to crawl toward my phone, which had fallen near the fridge. I needed to call for help myself if they wouldn't do it. But before I could reach it, my husband stepped forward. He didn't pick it up to hand it to me. Instead, he grabbed the phone and placed it high on the counter, far out of my reach. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I felt a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I was dying right in front of them, and they were watching me like I was a bad television show. "Drama queen," my mother-in-law muttered. I heard the sound of her heels clicking on the tile as she turned away. The last thing I remember before the darkness finally swallowed me whole was the sound of the front door slamming shut. They didn't stay to watch me die, but they didn't call for an ambulance either. They simply left me alone on the floor of a dark house, hoping I wouldn't be there when they got back. The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. I felt my spirit slipping away into a deep, heavy blackness. I woke up to the rhythmic, mechanical sound of beeping. My eyes felt heavy, and there was a strange plastic mask over my face. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then, the memory of the kitchen floor came rushing back. A nurse appeared over me, her eyes filled with a kindness I hadn't seen in a long time. She told me I was in the hospital and that I had coded in the ambulance. That meant my heart had stopped. She said a neighbor had heard a loud thud and became worried when no one answered the door. Hours later, my husband walked into the room. I expected him to look relieved or guilty, but he just looked annoyed. He walked to the foot of my bed and let out a long breath. He wasn't worried about my health. He was frustrated that his day had been interrupted. When the doctor came in and started asking questions about how long I had been feeling ill, my husband didn't hesitate. He interrupted the doctor immediately. "She overreacts to everything," he said with a fake smile. "She's always had a flair for the theatrics." He was trying to downplay the fact that I had almost died. The doctor looked at my husband, then looked at the chart, and then back at my husband. She could see the monitors showing my unstable heart rate. She didn't look like she believed him at all. She asked him to step out of the room so she could finish my examination in private. My husband started to argue, his face turning a dark shade of red, but the doctor remained firm. Minutes later, I heard raised voices in the hallway. I looked through the small glass window in the door and saw 2 large security guards approaching him. They didn't just ask him to move, they escorted him out of the building. As he was being led away by his arms, he locked eyes with me through the glass. He wasn't scared that I had nearly lost my life. He was absolutely furious. That was the moment the scales fell from my eyes. I realized he wasn't a man who had panicked in an emergency. He was a man who was terrified of what I might tell the medical staff. He wanted me silent, and he was angry that I was still alive to speak. The security guards disappeared around the corner, leaving me in the quiet room. The cardiologist came back in after the hallway drama had settled down. She sat on the edge of a chair near my bed and took my hand. She explained that I had suffered a severe cardiac event caused by a condition I never knew I had. Her voice was gentle, but her words were heavy. "If you had arrived even 30 minutes later," she told me, "you wouldn't be here right now." I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked at her and finally found the courage to say it out loud. I told her my husband saw me fall and refused to call for help. Her expression shifted from professional concern to something much darker. She didn't look surprised, which was the scariest part. She began writing everything down in my permanent medical record. She documented the delay in care and the behavior of my family. Then, she leaned in and asked a question that made my stomach drop into my shoes. "Has this happened before?" she asked. At first, I wanted to say no. I wanted to protect the image of my marriage. But then I started to remember the times I had brushed off as accidents, and the times I felt sick. Flashbacks began to hit me like a physical weight. I remembered the headaches I complained about months ago that left me dizzy and nauseous. My husband had told me I was just stressed and needed to stop whining. I remembered the fainting spell I had at a family dinner. His mother had laughed and said I was trying to take the spotlight away from her birthday. I even remembered the time he cancelled my appointment with a specialist because it conflicted with a golf outing he wanted to attend. He told me I looked fine, so I must be fine. I had spent years being gaslit into believing I was a hypochondriac. I always thought I was overthinking things or being too sensitive. But standing on the edge of death changed my perspective. When the nurse returned to check my she informed me that someone from the patient advocacy office wanted to speak with me. My case had raised several red flags with the hospital staff. They told me that for my own safety, my husband had been barred from visiting me until further notice. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of relief in my chest. Once I was strong enough to hold my phone, I saw that I had several missed calls and a voicemail. My heart began to race as I played the message. It wasn't a message of love or an apology for leaving me on the floor. It was a recording of my husband's angry, trembling voice. "You humiliated me at the hospital," he hissed into the phone. "Mom is absolutely furious about the scene you caused. You need to tell the doctors you exaggerated your symptoms." He was still trying to control the narrative even while I was in a hospital gown. Then I listened to a message from my mother-in-law. Her voice was cold and calculated. "If you ruin my son's reputation over your little dramatics, you will regret it," she warned. Usually, messages like this would make me feel small and shaky. I would have spent the afternoon wondering how to make them happy again. But as I looked at the heart monitor and the oxygen tank, I didn't feel small. I felt a hot, burning anger. I realized they didn't care about me at all. I was just an obstacle to their perfect image they wanted to keep. A nurse named Alice came in to change my bandages later that evening. She looked around to make sure the door was shut, then she leaned in close. She told me something that made my blood run cold. When the paramedics had arrived at our house that night, they didn't find my husband inside helping me. They found him outside in the driveway, standing by his car and arguing with his mother. They weren't rushing to get inside. According to the paramedics' notes, they were actually debating whether to wait it out or call a private doctor later. Alice told me that when the responders asked what happened, my husband told them, "She does this for attention, don't rush." He had tried to slow down the people coming to save my life. Alice squeezed my hand firmly. "You almost died," she whispered. "Don't let them convince you otherwise. This wasn't just a case of a husband who didn't know what to do in a crisis. This was a man who saw an opportunity to let nature take its course. It wasn't neglect. It was deliberate, calculated cruelty." I thanked her for telling me the truth. The next morning, I began looking through the hospital paperwork and my personal files on my laptop. I came across something in our digital insurance portal that made my heart stop. Just 2 months ago, my husband had increased my life insurance policy significantly. He had opted for the maximum coverage possible for accidental death and illness. He had never mentioned this to me. I had signed some papers back then, but he had told me they were just for a new savings account for our future. He had lied to my face. The beneficiary listed was him, of course. But what was even more disturbing was that his mother was listed as the secondary beneficiary. They had a financial stake in my failing health. Suddenly, his impatience and his refusal to call 911 didn't just feel like a personality flaw. It felt like a motive. I realized I was living in a house with 2 people who were waiting for me to become a payout. The drama queen comments weren't just insults. They were a way to make sure no one looked too closely if I passed away. I felt a deep chill. I decided to check our shared bank accounts to see if anything else had changed. When I tried to log in, the screen flashed red. Invalid credentials. I tried again, thinking I had made a typo, but the result was the same. My access had been completely removed. I called the bank, and after a long wait, they told me that my husband had moved all the savings into a different account 2 days ago. He had also frozen the credit cards that were in my name, claiming they had been lost. He was already moving to trap me financially while I was still trapped in a hospital bed. My phone buzzed with a notification from a social media app. I clicked it and saw that he had made a public post. He wrote about my ongoing mental health struggles and how difficult it was to care for someone who was losing their grip on reality. My hands shook so hard I almost dropped the phone. He was building a story for the world to see, making sure that if I complained about him, people would think I was just confused. He was heartless. That afternoon, my neighbor who had called the ambulance came to visit. She brought me some magazines and a small plant. She looked nervous as she sat down. I didn't want to overstep, she said, but I saw something on my Ring camera that night that didn't sit right with me. She pulled out her phone and showed me the footage. It showed my husband standing in the driveway, staring at the front door. He was on his phone, but he wasn't calling 911. He was just standing there, checking his watch. The timestamp showed he stood there for 17 minutes before the sirens could be heard. He knew I was unconscious on the floor, and he did nothing. He just waited. My neighbor told me she had called because she heard me scream for help through the open kitchen window, and then she saw him come outside and just stand there. She knew something was wrong when he didn't look panicked at all. I asked her to send that video to my personal email immediately. I had the evidence I needed to prove he wasn't a grieving husband. I finally had proof. I knew I couldn't go back to that house. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in domestic issues and medical neglect. When I explained the insurance change, the financial lockout, the social media posts, and the Ring camera footage, the lawyer became very quiet. She told me that this was one of the most clear-cut cases of gross negligence she had seen in years. She told me that I wasn't just dealing with a divorce. I was dealing with a potential criminal situation if we played our cards right. She suggested that the first thing we do is file for a protective order. I hadn't realized how much I was actually afraid of my husband until she said that word. I realized that if he was willing to let me die on the kitchen floor, he was capable of much more if he felt backed into a corner. We started the paperwork right there in the hospital room. I felt like I was finally taking my life back, one signature at a time. The lawyer told me to keep my phone on and document every single message he sent me from that moment on. Despite the hospital's ban, my mother-in-law managed to slip past the front desk by pretending to be a distraught aunt. She walked into my room when the nurses were busy with a shift change. As soon as she saw me, her fake smile vanished. "You're destroying my son's life," she hissed, leaning over my bed. "He's a good man, and you're making him look like a monster." I didn't back down this time. I looked her right in the eye and told her I had seen the Ring footage. I told her I knew they stood in the driveway for 17 minutes while I was dying. She went completely pale, her mouth hanging open for a second. For the first time in the 10 years I had known her, she looked unsure of herself. She tried to say the camera must be wrong, but I told her the police would be the ones to decide that. She turned around and practically ran out of the room. I realized then that she wasn't just an enabler, she was the architect of his behavior. They were both terrified of the truth coming out to the world. My husband didn't stop his online attacks. He doubled down, claiming that I was confused due to the heavy medication the hospital had me on. He even reached out to some of our mutual friends, telling them that I was hallucinating things that never happened. But his plan started to backfire. A mutual friend of ours, who worked as a receptionist at a nearby clinic, commented on his post. "Then why did hospital security have to escort you out?" she asked publicly. "That doesn't happen to worried husbands who care about their wives." The narrative he had worked so hard to build began to unravel in front of everyone. Other people started chiming in, asking why he was posting on Facebook instead of being by his wife's side. He ended up deleting the entire post an hour later, but it was too late. My sister had already taken screenshots of everything. The internet never forgets, and his attempts to discredit me only made him look more guilty. He was losing his grip on the situation, and I could feel his desperation growing through the angry texts he kept sending me constantly. The official hospital report was finally finished. My lawyer brought me a copy, and reading it was a surreal experience. The report specifically stated, "Significant delay in emergency response by household members contributed to the severity of the cardiac event." It was right there in black and white, written by medical professionals. This wasn't just my word against his anymore. It was a documented fact. My lawyer called it devastating documentation that would be the centerpiece of our legal case. This shifted everything from an emotional dispute into a serious legal battle. The hospital was required to report such incidents to the authorities when there was a suspicion of foul play or extreme neglect. I realized that my life was never going to be the same, but for the first time, that thought didn't scare me. I was no longer the woman on the kitchen floor. I was a survivor with a paper trail. I spent the evening quiet and focused, preparing myself for the long road of recovery and justice that lay ahead. I felt a new strength growing in me as I read the report. A week later, I was discharged from the hospital. I didn't go home. I went to my sister's house, which was a 3-hour drive away. One afternoon, my husband showed up on her doorstep. He was crying, his eyes red and his clothes wrinkled. He looked like a broken man. He begged to see me, saying he had panicked and didn't know what to do. He claimed his mother had pressured him to stay outside because she thought I was faking. For a split second, seeing him like that made me feel a tiny spark of pity. Maybe he was just weak, I thought. Maybe he really did just freeze up. But then I remembered the bank accounts. I looked at him through the screen door and asked one simple question. If you were just panicking about my health, why did you move all our money into your mother's account the very next morning? The crying stopped instantly. His face went blank, and the sad husband mask fell away. He didn't have an answer for me. He just turned around and walked back to his car without saying another word to me. My lawyer managed to subpoena the bank records, and what we found was even worse than I imagined. He hadn't just moved the money after the incident. He had been slowly transferring small amounts of funds for months into a secret account co-owned by his mother. He had been doing this while telling me we were tight on money, and that I couldn't afford to see a specialist for my heart. The betrayal burned much deeper than the medical neglect ever could. He had been planning a life without me for a long time. Every emergency I had was just an opportunity for him to get closer to that life insurance payout. I felt sick to my stomach realizing that the man I had slept next to for years was looking at me as a financial transaction. My sister sat with me as I cried, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of mourning for the person I thought he was. I was done being a victim. It was time to involve the police officially and let them handle the man who once claimed to love me. With the Ring camera footage and the medical reports in hand, I went to the local police station. I filed an official report for domestic neglect and financial fraud. I told the officer that I wasn't doing this to be mean or to get revenge. I was doing it because I was afraid for my life. A few days later, my husband was served with legal papers while he was at his office. The very thing he feared most, public humiliation, was finally happening. His co-workers saw him being handed the papers, and the news spread through our small town like wildfire. He could no longer hide behind his perfect husband image. People knew the truth now. My lawyer told me that the police were taking the delayed call aspect very seriously. They were looking into whether his actions met the criteria for criminal endangerment. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The system was finally working to protect me, rather than being used as a weapon against me by my own family. I breathed a sigh of relief as I walked away from the station that afternoon. My mother-in-law began calling me non-stop from a blocked number. When I finally picked up, she didn't apologize. She accused me of ruining their family's reputation and stealing her son's future. Then, in her anger, she made a massive mistake. If you drop the charges and the divorce, we will return the funds to you, she said. I made sure my phone was recording. She had just admitted that she knew exactly where the money was and that they were using it as a bargaining chip. She had confirmed that she was an accomplice to the financial theft. I didn't say a word in response. I just hung up and sent the recording to my lawyer. They were so desperate to stay out of trouble that they were handing me all the evidence I needed on a silver platter. It was clear that they didn't think I had the spine to follow through with the legal battle. They thought they could still bully me into submission like they had done for years. They were very, very wrong. I was much stronger than they ever gave me credit for. Because of the suspicious timing of the life insurance increase right before a near-fatal event, the insurance company opened its own investigation. They didn't like the look of the policy change followed by a delayed emergency call. Now, my husband was being questioned by insurance investigators as well as the police. The public narrative had completely shifted. He was no longer the saintly husband dealing with a sick wife. He was a man under heavy scrutiny for potential fraud and greed. He tried to claim that the insurance increase was just good financial planning, but the investigators pointed out that he hadn't increased his own policy, only mine. Everything was falling apart for him. His mother tried to hire a high-priced lawyer, but the evidence was so overwhelming that no one could make it disappear. I watched from a distance as their carefully constructed world crumbled. I was safe at my sister's, focusing on my physical therapy and getting my heart back to a healthy rhythm. I knew I was on the right path to healing and finding my own peace away from them. The day finally came for us to appear in court for the preliminary hearing. When the Ring camera footage was played on the big screen, the entire room went silent. You could hear a pin drop as the judge watched my husband stand in the driveway for 17 minutes while I was dying inside. His lawyer tried to argue that he was in a state of shock and didn't know what to do at the moment. But the judge wasn't buying it at all. Why did he increase the life insurance policy 2 months prior if he didn't expect a medical event? The judge asked. His lawyer had no answer for that. My husband sat at the table with his head down, refusing to look at me across the room. For the first time, he looked small and weak. He didn't have his mother there to whisper poison in his ear. He was just a man facing the consequences of his own choices. The judge ruled that the evidence of neglect was overwhelming and moved the case forward. I felt a massive surge of triumph as I stood up to leave the courtroom. Facing a potential criminal trial for fraud and endangerment, my husband offered a quiet settlement. He agreed to give me full financial restitution, including all the money he had moved to his mother's account. He also agreed to issue a public retraction of all the lies he had told about my mental health on social media. Most importantly, he agreed to vacate our house and never contact me again for the rest of his life. I accepted the offer, but only after my lawyer added a clause that he could never benefit from any insurance in my name again. I moved back into my home, but I changed the locks and installed a top-tier security system with cameras. I spent weeks cleaning out his things and his mother's influence from every room. The house felt lighter, as if it were finally breathing again after a long time. I wasn't afraid of the shadows in the hallway anymore. I had faced the worst thing a person could face and I had come out on the other side. My heart was healing every single day. I decided to share my story on social media, but I didn't do it with anger or hate. I posted the facts, the medical reports, and a blurred version of the footage that showed the timeline. I wanted people to know that medical gaslighting and domestic neglect are real things that happen to people. I received thousands of messages from women who had experienced similar things in their own lives. They told me that my story gave them the courage to speak up about their own emergencies that were ignored by their partners. I realized that what happened to me wasn't a rare accident or a one-time thing. It was part of a larger pattern of how some people treat those they are supposed to protect and love. I became an advocate for patient rights and domestic safety in my community. My husband and his mother tried to move to another town to start over, but their names were now linked to the story forever. They couldn't run away from the truth of what they had done to me. I felt a sense of purpose. My mother-in-law saw me one last time in the court hallway when we were finalizing the papers. She tried to shame me and make me feel guilty one last time. She whispered that I was a heartless woman for doing this to her son. I didn't let it bother me. I stood taller than I ever have in my life. I looked her right in the eye and said, "You almost let me die for a check." She had no comeback for that. She just turned her head and walked away with her shoulders slumped. She knew I was no longer the girl she could push around. I had found my voice and I was using it. I walked out of that courthouse into the bright sunshine, feeling like a new person. I was free from their control and their cruelty. My life was finally my own again, and I wasn't going to waste a single second of it. I had a long life ahead of me, and I was going to make it a beautiful one. I was finally happy and healthy. Months later, I am healthier than I have ever been. I have the proper medical treatment I need, and my heart is strong. I have my own bank accounts, my own life, and my own peace. My husband is back living in his mother's guest room, facing the reality of his ruined career and empty bank account. The life insurance policy is long gone. Sometimes, I still think about that night on the kitchen floor. I remember the cold tile and the feeling of my breath leaving me. But I don't think about it with fear anymore. I think about it as the moment I realized I deserved better than what I had. They thought I was weak and that I would just disappear quietly into the night. They were wrong. I fought for every breath, and then I fought for my justice in court. I survived a heart attack and a betrayal, and I came out stronger than ever before. This time, I didn't wait for someone to save me. I saved myself. I looked in the mirror and smiled, knowing the future was finally mine.